Hi, everyone. Welcome to Eagles Chat, New Mexico. Um, Lots of stuff going on in the NFL news. I'm sure you've all seen the videos of the Eagles ring ceremony, things like that. We'll get to those shortly. However, before we begin, I want to talk about something that's been dominating the football news the last few weeks. And that has been contracts and hold-ins and holdouts. And um, these are things that really bother me when you think about the average citizen out there who is working their 9 to 5 job, or you know someone in the food service industry who's working multiple shifts trying to get by. And the fact that these guys are haggling over whether or not something's going to be guaranteed versus you know 40 million as opposed to 38 million and a year, and you think about what that comes out to per game and game average. And I guess because I'm not a professional athlete, I don't totally get it, and I don't totally get the risk involved. But I do know from being in healthcare for over 30 years, there are risks not just to my body but to my health. Every single day I've taken care of tuberculosis patients, I have taken care of patients who are positive for HIV and things like that. And when you think about that, if you make a mistake with those patients, you could lose your life. And and I'm lucky at the time to be making 70, $80,000 a year. Um, and then you think, like I said, then you talk about these guys haggling over a couple $1,000,000. Or as I heard somebody on the radio this morning, Ran Carthon talking, and he was former general manager of the Tennessee Titans. And little did I know until it was brought up, his father was Maurice Carthon, who played for the Giants in the 80s during their Super Bowl run then. Um, but he was talking about how these guys need to take care of their families and take care of their families for the rest of their lives and take care of their, and I'm like, that's a concept that's beyond the average person. And some of us are reluctant to talk about it because we don't want to be shut down. um but I find that something that is really, really difficult. you know I work contractual when I worked in higher ed, and those contracts were non-negotiable. You worked your year, and then if you got a raise, you got a raise, and if you didn't, you didn't. Even if you outperformed that contract. That's the big catch. That's the other big catchphrase. And you hear these guys, well, he outperformed his contract, and he's not going to show up to camp until he gets a new one, but he still has a contract. To me, you have a contract, you're obligated to show up for work. That is part of your professional ethic. And that's why I kind of admire what Lamar Jackson did a few years ago. He gambled on himself. He was like, the contract will take care of itself. I'm still going to play. And that's where I don't have as much respect for these guys who want to hold out. Um, there was the meme I'm sure you all had seen on the internet that TJ Watt is going to make more over the next 3 years than his brother made in his entire career. But I don't see JJ Watt hurting for money, you know. So, and TJ still had a contract. If you want the raise, you finish out your contract. That's how it works in the real world outside of professional sports. And, I get it, the entertainment value, things like that. Um, Players like James Cooks are holding in. They're still showing up for meetings. They're still there for practice. They're just not practicing. Well, that's just so they can draw a paycheck. They're sort of meeting their obligation. Micah Parsons, he kind of sounds like he's going to play regardless. So a little more respect for him and his contract hold in, but I still feel these guys have contracts. They should still stand up to them and pay, work for what they signed to agree to. You said you would work for me for 3 years. Here's the contract numbers you agreed upon, your agent agreed upon. If you outperform it, maybe that was their fault. They didn't put in enough incentives. If you lead the league in sacks or something, you get an extra $4 or $5 million, whatever the case may be. So, and that's Trey Hendrickson. So in some ways, I think these guys are trying to make ownership look like the bad guys, but not taking responsibility for how they negotiated those contracts in the first place. I don't care what Chris Sims says, or even though I like Florio, I don't care what Florio says, about these guys getting their money when they can. Um, I'm sure, if the shoe was on the other foot and NBC suddenly said, hey, you may be outperforming your contract, but you're not getting a new one for 2 more years, would they hold in or hold out? No, they would be fired, point blank. So I understand the stance, and maybe I don't totally get it because I've never seen that kind of money. That's more money than I'll ever make in my entire lifetime. Um, and since I'm approaching 60, I don't have much left in that lifetime, maybe 25, 30 years. Um, but these contracts are something that's starting to become old. You signed it, play for it. Shamar Stewart, that's a little different thing. Um, Cincinnati got burned with a draft pick a year or two ago. Guy ends up in prison. They're paying him while he's in prison. I understand why they want that language in his contract. But as Rand Carthon said this morning on the opening drive, um, we're airing it out. I forget what show I was listening to on the NFL Network. Um, you know, that's something you do at a regime change. That's something you do if you have a general manager change. You just don't suddenly throw it out there, not letting anybody know that this is how you're doing it. So I can see that. And if you had a problem with the guy's character in the beginning, that you want that kind of language in a contract, then you should have probably not drafted him or not drafted him as high as you did. Um, I did see where Knight, their second round pick, did sign for an 80% guarantee. Maybe that's something that they can play with Shamar Stewart and play with the numbers. But his contract should be easy to deal with. So that's my little rant on contracts and how I think they should work. And I know if like some famous guy like TJ Watt or somebody actually comes across his video and says, hey, that guy knows absolutely nothing. He's right. I know absolutely nothing about it. I've never made that kind of money. I've never had anybody ever offer me that kind of money. And maybe I would want more. So I get that. I do some consulting. I would love to make more off of that. And do this as just my hobby instead of, a way that actually it has become a hobby. I've enjoyed putting these videos out there, and speaking my mind about the Eagles. So, and now NFL news and contracts. So let's move on to Eagles news of the week. And the reason that some of you actually come and watch my channel. So Eagles ring ceremony, like I said, I'm sure you've all seen the videos. Those things are beautiful. Little outprice for the average fan. You can buy replicas for right around $1,000, or paperweights for a couple $100 that look like them. I do have a duplicate of the 52 ring. Was not that expensive. Of course, it's not as fancy as the Super Bowl 59 ring. But those rings were absolutely gorgeous. And I love the videos of AJ Brown and Saquon Barkley and especially Cooper DeJean and Reed Blankenship when they saw them, how they freaked out. I think I would have been the same way. I would have had that same reaction. Same with Devonta Smith. I think that's the other video that's kind of floating around out there on the internet, on YouTube. Just one of the things has been everybody says Hurts doesn't want to wear his. I think he's just being Jalen Hurts. He puts it on, it means he's a champion. But if he doesn't, he knows that there's work to be done to do this again. And I think that that's part of it. I think that's part of what drives Jalen, is that desire to always want to excel. And if he accepts that championship ring, you know, maybe the desire doesn't go away, but it's that tangible, hey, we're at the end. And if he doesn't put it on, he's not at the end. He's still on that path to his gold jacket, to borrow Devonta Smith's statement. I've seen the interview of Devonta Smith with Shannon Sharp, and he was talking about, that's his goal at the end of his career is for a gold jacket. That can be a little bit of, giving the Eagles offense kind of run happy right now. We may not see that on his career trajectory. And that's because the news media plays a big role in who gets in and who doesn't. And when they look at Devonta Smith's numbers, he's not going to have, AJ Brown numbers. He's not going to have some of the other numbers, Jamar Chase, Jefferson, guys like that. So maybe not in his future, but who knows, with enough championships, there'll be definitely votes to be had. There'll be votes to be had. Barkley, from what I understand, only wore his ring once. Put it on, tried it on, took it off. And I think part of that's that Jalen Hurts mentality. Just, hey, this is what we did. This is what we've done. It's now part of the past. Let's move on, get ready for 2025. I think that's it in a nutshell. Not much more than that. So I don't know why there's a lot of chatter about it out there. Things like that. As far as TJ Watt being signed, I hope that finally silences people about, Watt could be an Eagle in the future. I think this is where he retires. This is his retirement contract. I saw a couple of videos, and even my son mentioned to me about, there's this whole Von Miller, he signed with Washington, are the Eagles in trouble? I don't think so. Buffalo and some other team, he wouldn't have walked away as easily as he has. People be lining up the door to re-sign him. They wouldn't be waiting until July to sign him. That may have been a little bit his thing of just, hey, I'm going to see what's out there and where's my best option to win a championship. However, I don't see where it's going to be that big of a deal, especially not with the bookends of Mulata and Lane Johnson on the ends. Those guys are dominating tackles. They will always be dominating tackles. Somebody moves Von Miller inside, or he twists or he turns, he's going to run into Dickerson. He's going to run into Jurgens. He's still the right side's a little bit up for grabs. We'll talk about that in a little bit as we talk about training camp opening this week. But I'm not as feared of the Von Miller signing as some others. Maybe I should be. Maybe I'm the one being a little naive and complacent, and I'll fully admit that. But I really think this is, a Von Miller's career. This may be his last stop. So, other exciting news in the Eagles world today is, training camp opens. And the best part of that is, with training camp opening yesterday, Makuba was signed to his fully guaranteed deal. And that's going to bring up, what's going on in the secondary, who's going to start and who's back there for the secondary. I think there's going to be some added pressure on him to produce right away, especially since it's a guaranteed deal. And will he be starting safety? Will he play nickel? Will DeJean move out to that corner spot, and then, he'll play nickel in there with Reed back there at safety, so there's going to be some changes there, I think. But I think it opens the door to all four DB positions. We know, Mitchell's going to always be on one side. We know DeJean is starting. We know Reed starting. But that leaves the safeties and stuff open for debate. Let me just pull up a couple things here. So, yeah, so I think what I think is going to be is, I think it's going to be Reed at safety. I think Makuba's going to start at safety. You're not giving him a guarantee contract. And the Eagles probably like what they have seen from him so far in OTAs, things like that. He didn't miss OTAs, so he was there. He's not missing any training camp. Um, who's going to start opposite Mitchell, the kid from the Giants, or is it going to be um, Bailey Ringo? Some people said he looked really good in OTAs. Have to take their word for it. But I think the secondary is going to be young. They're going to be strong. Um, Other camp battles, we know there won't be one for special teams. The Eagles only have one long distance snapper, and that's Hewlett, who they, got from Cleveland. Um, Kind of surprised I let Lovato go, but from what I understand, that was part of Jake's misses last year. Mann's going to be back, one of the top punters in the league. His net was 42 yards. I remember back in my youth, net for a punter, a good net for a punter was, anything close to 40. And, Mann was eighth or ninth in the league, something like that, at 42. So that's worth it. That's a good take on, in my opinion. And then of course, Jake, he may have been a little bit of a shaky season, but he was money, in the playoffs and in the Super Bowl, only missing one kick, and of course not missing anything in the Super Bowl, which is where I had the biggest nerves in the Super Bowl every time the Eagles lined up for a field goal, always knowing that hey, sometimes Jake even misses extra points. So, there were those concerns, but I see if that happens again this year, there would definitely will be talent, brought in to push him a little bit at kicker next season. So I think 2025 is a make it or break it year for Jake. Even though he's got two Super Bowl rings, he's been here, since basically his rookie year, since getting signed off the Bengals practice squad. What a move that was, doing that. So, um, and then one of his first kicks was that big 60-yarder against the Giants. The next camp battle I see is at right guard. You have Steen and Pryor, Hinton, Keegan, Kennard, Toth, and our rookies Williams, Kendall, Hinton, Pierce and Tate. I really see, the Eagles aren't going to keep 7, 8 additional offensive linemen. I know they like to rotate them. Um, I still think Steen's a swing guy. Pryor's a crafty veteran who's been around for a while. He's been with the Eagles before. He kind of knows a little bit of the system, how things are done there. Um, Cameron Williams was a road grader for Texas. I could see him and Miles Hinton making the team, and just basically, like I said, I'm a big Miles Hinton fan because I was a big fan of his dad. So I'm hoping that he does well, and kind of pull some things together there. Drew Kendall's dad played in the NFL, so he's got some experience there. What it takes to succeed in the NFL. But that's where I see the other big battle taking place. Or will Stoutland University resurrect Kennard's career after being subpar for the Texans for the last few years. Number 3, wide receiver depth is I still see this as, Dotson's job to lose. Um, Regardless of what anybody said, again, that's the people looking at numbers. That's the fantasy people looking at, whether or not he's got the fantasy numbers to excel. When your primary is AJ Brown, your secondary is Devonta Smith, your check down is, going to be Saquon out of the backfield. Or I'm hoping, I really like Shipley when he was in college, or Shipley checking down out of the backfield. I don't see that third receiver getting a lot of catches. I think a good season for Dotson and for number 3 with the Eagles is going to be 50, 60 catches, maybe 600 yards. And I really think that's where he ends up. The other thing I see taking place is will Dillon or Shipley back up Barkley? Who's going to be that extra running back? Who's going to be that third down back? Who's going to spell him? So those are things that I think are still open for debate, but I'm pulling for Shipley. The Eagles have a tendency to go youth. And I was not a huge fan of Gainwell or maybe not the way the Eagles use Gainwell. Using him in third and short and handing the ball off to him, I don't think was something he was ever going to excel at. But I see him he should have been more like a third down spell, receiving type back, which is where I think he excelled when he did get the ball in those situations. Um, and that's where I see Shipley excelling, except for Shipley can run between the tackles. That was one of the things I saw him do in college, where I really think that he can continue to excel in the NFL. We saw his speed. He did get caught from behind, but he eventually got his touchdown in the playoffs. And, we all saw the video of Saquon being the first one off the bench to celebrate with him. Um, so I see that there. I see that. Um, the last thing I want to bring up is I still have this debate, and I've heard them talk about, Tom Papa talking about this on the opening drive on Sirius XM. And they were talking about these guys playing starters in the preseason. And, is the NFL happy with 4 sloppy weeks of football before the last 15 games of the season, or whatever that comes out to, 13 games of the season? I, as a fan, am not. I think that playoff implications, there was Cincinnati lost to a very bad New England team right out of the gate. Cincinnati's a notorious slow starting team. They never play their starters in the preseason. And, losing those 3-4 games right in the beginning of the season, they would have been in the playoffs had they won even 2 of them. So I think it's a bad deal. I think some teams, especially borderline teams, are setting themselves up for failure to miss in the playoffs by not playing starters, or at least giving them at least a starting series of each game. I know you got a lot of guys you want to look at. You got to make those roster cuts from 90 to 53, in 3 weeks. So a lot of hard decisions there. But I still think these guys need to play at least a series or 2 in the preseason. That way, that's why I'm not as optimistic about everybody saying, "Oh, the Eagles are just going to blow out Dallas the first week." I'm not as optimistic about it because, and I'll get into the schedule here in a minute. If the Eagles starters don't play in the preseason and they come out looking sloppy like they did at the beginning of last year, I mean, granted, we went on a Super Bowl run. I still think that they are primed for an upset to the Cowboys. And that's kind of my take on the first week of the season. The second game, is the Super Bowl rematch against the Chiefs the following week. Schedule makers were not nice to the Eagles, one of the toughest schedules in the league. But that's what you get when you're the Super Bowl champ. You still play the teams in the other divisions, but those extra games are against first place teams where, if you were a last place team, those extra games are against last place teams. So, makes it a little easier for teams like Washington and stuff to bounce from lower tier to upper tier. So we'll have to see where they're at. And then my breakdown of that game is we'll see how improved the KC offensive line is. Will their game plan for the Eagles be a little bit different? Will the Eagles' defensive game plan be a little bit different, knowing that KC will make changes? Will Vic be able to call some of the same defenses? Because hopefully KC learned from the Super Bowl what to play, what to call, what not to call against the way the Eagles play them. I think they'll have a little more of a shell over the passing game, knowing that Jalen is not the guy they thought he was, that he really can pass the ball. So I see that game being a really tight one, much like the game a few years ago, after the Eagles lost the Super Bowl, but then beat KC in KC. The third game of the year against the Rams, I think the Rams could have had the Eagles number in the playoffs. But I think that that's a game that, again, I see the Eagles running the ball a lot. I see the Eagles trying to shred that defense a little bit, getting them to play up, go too deep in coverage, open up some passing lanes for Devonta Smith and AJ Brown, and the Eagles being able to get something done in behind the defense, which will then soften it back up. They'll run Hurts, they'll run Barkley again. Eagles have a really good balanced offense. I think they match up well with the Rams. So I see that that could be a win. I could see the Eagles 2-1 after the first 3 weeks. Will it be the games that I predicted? Who knows? Like I said, without a preseason, Eagles have a tendency to look a little sloppy in the beginning of the year. So 0-3 is also a possibility there. Um, but I really think, especially if the Parsons holdout goes on for a period of time, the Cowboys could be, the Eagles could beat the Cowboys right out of the gate. Um, but those next two are going to be really tough. But I think the Rams is a win, and KC could go either way. But right now I'm leaning towards KC getting a little bit of Super Bowl revenge um, for that particular game. So that's all I have for this week on Eagles Chat, New Mexico, and I hope you all have a great day.